Now, our next important, historian is, or philosopher of history is Oswald Spengler, born in 1880, died in 1936. Now, he is a very interesting, personality. He was born on 29th May 1880 at Blankenburg, Germany, and died on 8th May in 1936 at Munich. A German philosopher, he is known, like Toynbee, for propounding the theory of cyclical change. His book, the German title is Der Untergang des Abendlandes, that is, Decline of the West, was published in 1918, soon after World War I. He thus wrote at a time when Germany had been defeated in the First World War, 1914-1918, and the aftermath of this incident had led many to believe that ascendancy of European civilization was reaching its close. It was declining. So, he also wrote after the major structures of Weberian sociology had been constituted on one hand, and on the other, the neo-Kantian thought had been established as the official thought of Germany. Spengler was influenced by both these systems of thought, though he utilized their analysis in a very different manner. From Max Weber, he derived the concept that each culture has its own values whose sources are unknown. Each culture, in other words, can be defined by its particular values, special values, and these values were represented by particular symbols in each age. For example, the values of the classical age were epitomized by the figures of human nudes representing the love for human body. The values of Christian Europe were represented by the church power. Each culture, he further goes on, enjoys a separate entity in terms of its specific values, which are totally disjuncted from one another. There is no interrelationship or interactions between cultures, and for this reason, no culture can be rescued by another. It can only be decimated by another. Further, each culture has a life of its own. It is talking in terms of a lifespan of about, say, 1000 years, during which it is born, gets young, matures and dies, to be replaced by another, which in turn repeats the same process before being replaced by yet another culture, and so on. The cycle will go on unendingly. Between the values of two cultures, one vanquished and the other victor, there would be nothing in common. He further contended that contemporary times represented the decline of the West. He is talking about his time. This decline, he believes, was most effectively represented by the defeat of Germany, or for Germany was central to the preservation of the European culture. He became a cult figure for the Nazis because of these sayings, 1933-1945. English historians described him as disreputable seer of West Germany. But when he issued a statement condemning the oppression of Jews in Nazi Germany, he lost much of his political support in Germany as well. So, he stuck to his arguments. It must not be forgotten that his thesis of the superiority of Germany was based not on theory of race, but on in the theory of values. He is not, he is not talking about racial supremacy, and he could see no reason why the Jews could not share these values that he thought mark out Germany from other nations in the world. So, all people living in a country, they represent one culture and they have similar cultural values, whether they are Jews or Christians or anybody else, that constitute one whole. So, he says that one particular kind of people will have only one set of values. And extending it further, we find next theorist who will believe in cyclical theory of civilization is Arnold J. Toynbee, born in 1889 and died in 1975. So, he was born on April 14th, 1889, London, England, died October 22, 1975, York, North Yorkshire. An English historian whose 12-volume study of history, 1934 to 61, it was published, is a monumental work. It has a, diminutive, revised, abridged edition as well. He was convinced that of the basic thesis of Spengler that human societies are distinguishable by their basic values, and that civilizations, he prefers the term civilization to culture, move in cycles. So, a study of historical sources all over the world which he surveyed suggested him that there were at the time he was writing 22 civilizations in both the old and the new world. He has calculated them and he is talking about them. According to him, each civilization has value systems based on Spengler, and he particularly draws upon literary traits and features of art and architecture. According to him, these traits were obviously those of high cultures, that is to say, the culture of the aristocracy. He leaves unanswered the questions of the difference in value systems of high and low cultures, and thus seems unconvincing on the question of value identification. Vast population which are not high, aristocrats, where will you place their culture? They also have certain values. Each civilization, he proceeds, has a cycle, but it is not necessary for all civilizations to have a full cycle. All civilizations don't, turn full circle, in other words. Civilizations could be arrested or overthrown either by political defeat or, seen in the case of Sparta, or owing to the economic vulnerabilities like nomadic civilizations. They didn't complete their full cycle. But such instances are rare, according to him. Most civilizations are strong enough to survive and defend themselves against other civilizations who have other values. But as they develop, after having their maturity, attaining their maturity, they fail to adequately respond to internal challenges such as the growth of population, pressing against their resources, ethical breakdown, erosion of legitimacy of the ruling class, etc., etc. As the internal crisis grows, according to him, he uses the Marxian term proletariat, but it has a different meaning. That is why I have put the proletariat within quotes. A vague term used by Toynbee for all lower classes begins to rebel. Marx, by proletariat, Marx meant only the working class. He includes everyone in that. Begins to rebel against the ruling dominant classes, leading ultimately to the collapse of a civilization. The breakdown of a civilization does not mean the seizure of territorial expansion. Often the revolts of the proletariat force the rulers to strengthen their political base by resorting to expansion. In making this modification, it seems Toynbee had the mighty Roman Empire in mind. Furthermore, decline also does not mean, according to him, that achievements in knowledge and learning come to a closure. For the Hellenistic contributions to learning continued even after the decline of Greek civilization. He quotes from there. Decline sets in, and that is the main criteria on which to identify the stage of civilization, when its value system begins to get eroded. Here he is disagreeing with Spengler, and disagreeing with Spengler, he sees civilizations as being connected to one another. Spengler does not believe in that, and argues that sometimes a dying civilization may get affiliated to another civilization in order to become an independent civilization later on. Thus, for instance, he compares, he says, the Arabian civilization may be seen as an affiliate of the Greek, the dying civilization, and also Persian civilization. Modern European civilization, he says, had reached the period of breakdown, though not of its end, for while its values were declining, its contribution to science and technology continued unabated. Toynbee, it seems, himself challenged his own theory when in the conclusion of the last volume of his study of history, I mean the 12th volume, when he is making revisions, he says technology is after all the basis of civilization. Earlier he was saying values, now he is saying technology is after all the basis of civilization. Coolburn says that in this single sentence, by admitting that technology and not values are the basis of civilization, Toynbee himself brings down the edifice he had so painstakingly built. So, let us see his cyclical theory of civilization, where you will find he is differing with Spengler. So, let us delve into his cyclical theory of civilizations. What does it mean and how he explains it in all those massive volumes. We have selected instances from there for your for the sake of brevity and making the arguments close knitted. Central to cyclical theory propounded by Toynbee is the question whether there is a rhythm in history. He is trying to find some rhythm in history. For all those who have believed in this theory have seen a rhythm in historical movements. There could, however, be several versions of this rhythm, moving accordingly with cycles they cause. One version of the cycle would be to examine individual civilizations in their process of their birth, rise, stagnation and death, to be followed by another, but within a static view of human development. The human development remains static and these kind of changes are taking place. So, they are sometime going up, sometime going down, like like this, this is static and this kind of thing will go like this kind of thing. So, that he is explaining that this is the rhythm which you find in any civilization for that matter. Second version seeks to relate the rise and fall of civilizations to general development of mankind. It may view the cycle of civilization either in relation to some absolute criteria or in general terms of progress. This would will be moving like this. Third version sees human society as continuously going upward in a linear manner, in which there is neither a decline nor a rise, but a change in its form. What may appear as decline or according to certain criteria of culture may not be decline if seen in relation with other features. This version falls very much in line with Marxian theory of history. Here he is telling us like this civilization will move like this. Each of these versions, three versions, impose a rhythm and therefore, any examination of cyclical theories has to begin with first examining the question of whether there is a rhythm in history at all, that is to say, a repetition of historical movements in the broadest possible manner. History repeats itself, it is has often been said, earlier also we had discussed this axiom. It is said, if individual lives have the rhythm, that is, all human beings have birth, childhood, youth, maturity, old age and death, that is what he means by rhythm, then why not historical movements? If its component has a rhythm, why not the final product? There is therefore a tendency to ascribe to historical movements the same kind of rhythm that are noticeable in human lives, but there are difficulties in doing so, practical difficulties. When you are dealing with history, you are not dealing with individuals as such, but their relationships you are dealing with. Therefore, how far can it be justified to apply to historical movements this kind of biological rhythm, where the latter is concerned with particular individuals, the former with their relationships? Herbert Spencer and Spengler both argue that in all societies, human relationships institutionalize themselves to such an extent so as to become almost organic beings and subject themselves to laws which are very much analogous to biological laws. This seems a very unconvincing escape. There is no proof to substantiate the claim of societies being organic. Nobody says that. It is indeed very doubtful to substantiate this argument by the belief of consciousness of cultures, because we know for sure that many societies which we identify today were hardly conscious of themselves as a separate entity. Rather, they could see no unity but ample contradictions and diversity among themselves. Thus, Toynbee rightly rejects this thesis, arguing that societies are not organic entities, but rather constitute relationship between individuals or sets of individuals. The question thus remains, how is the rhythm of history to be identified? Historians like Fisher, we have discussed earlier, who believes in one contingency following other, like him could see no rhythm in history. Why? Because history for them was simply one contingency falling upon the another. The role of accidents in history they are highlighting. Although ultimately he doesn't pursue that theory till the end of the book. Otherwise, why he was calling we the son of the Hellas, means you are continuing from Greek culture. So, wherein there are no laws, no causal relationship and no predictability in how historical movements happened. So, history has nothing but an interplay of contingencies and accidents, according to Fisher. These absolute statements of Fisher, however, were repudiated later on, partly by himself. Fisher does not seem to take into account two factors pointed out by Toynbee. Before assessing the validity of causative factors, how important they are, consequential factors or challenges, which this is Toynbee's term, challenge and response given earlier by Ibn Khaldun, of a particular historical occurrence. One, freedom of choice of individuals, and second, the circumstances under which this freedom is exercised, or the constraining factors, the restricting factors within which the choice is exercised, not essentially created by individuals. Given these two factors, it has been found that human responses to particular circumstances tends to be more or less identical. This obviously does not exclude uniqueness of response. For how else can one explain such great men like Lenin, Mao Zedong or Gandhiji? They are all very different. But then on occasions, I will include Buddha also in this, but then on occasions it may be found that success of some historical heroes can be explained by the fact that they could consciously identify the human response in their given circumstances. Granted, therefore, that there is a rhythm in historical movements, but then does this imply a line of progress? If it does, then what are the criteria for determining it? How to identify it? Historians like Gibbon, whom we have already discussed earlier, being an agnostic, and Hegel, essentially religious, had argued in favor of the progress of men as against Christian belief of the fall of man. The famous, fall of Adam from heaven on earth. Gibbon could even assert that both material conditions and morality of man has been improving ever since, beginning. They were later supported by the findings of biologists, notably Darwin's theory of evolution of species. How are these assertions to be tested? I request all my students to read Charles Darwin's, evolution of species, famously known as survival of the fittest. In purely material terms, though not just on purely quantitative terms, but also in terms of individual's own perception of himself, the progress can be assessed by such criteria as average lifespan, how many years of life you have, per capita income. These could be the scientific criterions. per capita income, extent of literacy in a society, increase in population, productivity, seed yield ratio, landman ratio, produce per acre, etc., etc. Technology also can be another objective criterion, at least more objective than art and ideology. If these are the criteria, then progress is indisputable to discern. But the objection to these criteria is that, though seemingly objective, they are actually subjective. How can material progress be made the essential basis for assessing civilization? Asked Toynbee. How far these are necessarily related to the development of mankind as a whole? These are the questions put by Toynbee. Toynbee argues then that all these material criteria of progress are centered around purely material factors, which are key to individual selfishness and in turn ignore the spiritual element or moral content of mankind. After all, did not Hitler slaughter millions in an essentially modern age? Asked Toynbee. Could it therefore be said that ethics have improved? He argues that on the spiritual plane, there may have been both losses and gains, but essentially this would mean no progress. It is also true that traditional religions had a large number of accretions, meaningless rituals and rites. Modern rationality have driven them away, but in doing so, they have also driven away something more, the spiritual core of civilizations. Like any religious person who is addressing to mankind and not to specific religion, Toynbee immediately enters into difficulties with this kind of proposition. What does he mean by spiritual core then? He says he includes in it the ethics of all religions, from Gautam Buddha's Nirvana to the Jewish concept of God. If it is such a wide concept, then how are contradictions to be resolved, say between the essential atheism of Buddhism to an excessive emphasis on God in Jewish tradition or Jewish religion? He then says they are both contradictory to each other. He then says that the discoveries of religious leaders made intuitively in the domain of human ethics far surpass the contributions of science and technology, in the sense that whereas the realm of rationality, the core of the latter is limited, while in spiritualism, the core of the former is limitless. Spirituality is limitless, in other words. How does one get at the substance behind this rhetoric? Sometimes he seeks to take refuge from the contradictions he is confronted with in the concept of pantheism, arguing that it is the unity of beings that has to be the ideal towards which the humanity strives. At both places or at other places, however, he contradicts it by rejecting notion that there can be uniform ideal for mankind. Thus, while Toynbee raises a very pertinent question, he fails to provide it an equally convincing answer. There are other problems with Toynbee as well, one of them being the identification of civilizations. How to identify them? What should be the criterion? Toynbee says society is a network of human relations. It is not an organic unity. So, it has to be identified by its culture, which in turn can be identified by its ideology, arts, style, mode of life, etc. All civilizations are cultures, but not vice versa. A culture becomes a civilization only after a large surplus is generated to sustain a creative minority, growth of cities, art and architecture. One fails to see how does he reconciles his firm belief in the centrality of ideology as seen in the growth of a particular civilization with the admission that any civilization can come into being only after enough material progress has taken place in that society. So, Coolburn rightly points out that this is a reluctant concession conceded by Toynbee when driven to the wall. Civilization, Toynbee says, can be identified by its ideology, buildings, mode of living, etc. So far, so good. But what happens, as invariably happens in all civilizations, when there are two or more strands of ideology, architecture, etc. Toynbee then says religion has to be the central criterion, but this creates more problems than it solves. If Islamic civilizations is not to be dated from the time of Arab conquest, as Toynbee insists, because political conquest don't create civilizations, but from the time of that infusion of the Islamic ideology, then Islamic civilization must be said to begin at a time when most other Islamic historians would have thought it to decline. That is to say, later than 14th century AD. Why? Because it must not be forgotten that all contributions made towards science and knowledge during the Abbasid era becomes un-Islamic and it rejected the Islamic concept of all knowledge being subservient and subjugated to Islam. Likewise, the Christian civilization, for that matter, by Toynbee's own definition, can be said to begin only 200-300 years away from the period of Renaissance, which marked a return to pre-Christian learning, in the classical antiquity. Therefore, and thus this would mean the rejection of Christian values, because he dates it not with the victory of Christianity in the Roman Empire, but with this infusion into Western Europe, according to him, marked by proselytizing activities to a decline of Hellenic sciences. Thus, by seeking to determine civilizations essentially by its spiritual content or religion being its carrier, Toynbee is invariably confronted with problems of identification, from where he began. Towards the latter part of his life, he sought to take refuge in a much weaker identification by civilization's own consciousness. This kind of identification of belonging to a particular civilization is an entirely modern phenomenon. Thus, one may ask, were the Persians in the 14th century, for instance, aware of belonging to the Islamic civilization? The answer to which, in the light of above discussion, may seem very, very problematic. Toynbee also rejected the cause-consequences formula, which is so essential to historiography, in favor of challenge and response equation. Put in an equation, his formula is encounter is equivalent to challenge plus response, which will lead to stimuli, which will promote the civilization. Since human response to every challenge varies, identical causes cannot lead to identical consequences. An encounter therefore consists of a challenge and individuals or a set of individuals varied response, not identical response. It is this response that works as a stimuli to a civilization. For example, he gives, cites example, Hellenistic sciences posed a challenge to the Arabs. They could have responded, among others, in three ways: by rejecting it altogether, or by compartmentalizing it, adopting partly something, partly not, or by totally rejecting their faith. These are the three possible ways. So, they responded to it following the second way, that is, through compartmentalizing the knowledge and isolating religion from Greek learning. This particular response determined the nature of further development of the Arabs, and therefore acted as the stimuli for their growth and development later on. One could argue that his challenge response theory was a play of words, but indeed it acts as a corrective to purely determinist notions among historians. Toynbee felt that since technology is present everywhere, every civilization, so it cannot be considered to be a distinct feature of any civilization, nor, he says, can language be assigned a predominant value in the identification of civilization. So, the question of technology and language is ruled out. So, crucial thing according to him are ideology, thought and beliefs which, though divergent, have certain common features spread over a wide region which helps in identification. In other words, religion in the garb of higher thought is held by Toynbee to be essential feature of human civilizations. He considerably modified his list of civilizations, and by the time he reached his last volume, that is volume 12, where he will be revising many of his earlier findings, he considerably reduced the number in his list of world civilizations. And this list is divided basically in two parts. One is called full grown civilization, and the second is abortive civilizations, some civilizations which could not grow. The larger number of Toynbee civilizations are full grown ones, that is, they witness a full cycle of birth, infancy, youth, maturity, decline, and finally total disintegration. Abortive civilizations in Toynbee's list are 6 in number in total. They are those civilizations which at some point of time get eclipsed by another full blown civilization. That is to say, they get culturally absorbed or subjugated by another civilization. He recognizes that armed conquest, a spread of new religion, could abort civilizations. Full grown civilizations are further classified into two parts: independent civilizations and satellite civilizations. Very interesting categories. Independent civilizations like Indic, Scenic civilization, Chinese civilization are those whose origins are independent and who develop along independent lines, both Indic and Scenic. Satellite civilizations are separate but dependent for their sustained growth on other civilizations, and therefore their major features are not entirely separate from the civilizations whose satellite they are. For example, Japanese civilization was a satellite civilization of Scenic civilization. Independent civilizations were again subdivided into two. One is unrelated and unaffiliated civilizations, they have no direct relationship, and second is related and affiliated civilizations. The former are the original civilizations, for example, the Indus civilization, the Scenic civilization, the Hellenic civilization. They are independent, they are autonomous, so totally independent. All the major civilizations fall under Toynbee's latter category. These civilizations arise out of original civilizations. Indic civilization, for example, is an affiliation of Indus civilization. Islamic and Western civilizations are affiliate of Syriac and Hellenic civilizations, according to him. On pages 558 to 561, hardly 3-4 pages in the volume 12, where he is revising, Toynbee gives a list of civilizations. Significantly, nomadic cultures are not listed therein, and significantly I am not saying nomadic civilizations, because he does not believe in that, because these cultures according to him could not become civilizations and were therefore arrested civilization for want of adequate surplus. While showing a deep appreciation for Spengler's discovery of cycles, he, for this reason, calls him a genuine, while others of his time condemned him as a disreputable seer. He disagrees with his identification of civilization to organic entities and also refuses to accept any average lifespan of civilizations. He says civilizations are not organic entities, but they represent human relationships and cannot be assigned a particular lifespan. An examination of these relationships show a pattern which is cyclical, but bears no relationship with organic conditions. The pattern, broadly speaking, is this: evolution of civilization is always a work of a creative minority, which emerges only after a certain economic development had taken place. These minorities are responsible for creating specific features of a civilization, and these features, however, are not sufficient in themselves, but require at some point of time a universal state. This state is realized either by acquiring a particular attraction for state power, which is already growing and which begins to espouse and expands its features, for example, Alexander in relation to Hellenic civilization, or by its own advantages, civilization is able to create a situation when the state rising within it is able to subjugate it. That is to say, for example, Mauryan Empire in relation to the Indic civilization. In Toynbee's analysis, universal state comes after a civilization has defined its features and is therefore a later development. So, this creates difficulties for Toynbee in dating civilizations. Islamic civilization, for example, then can be said to begin only from the 13th century onwards. The entire Umayyad and Abbasid periods were thus to Toynbee pre-Islamic. He further says that the universal state phase is characterized by a strong polity and consequently leads to replacement of the creative minority by the dominant minority. Society begins to be dominated by people who are rich and prosperous, and because of their being so, insist on retaining the status quo. The innovativeness and brilliance of creative minority disappears, and civilizations is then set on the path of decline and disintegration. This stage of decline may go along with territorial expansion, greater pace of technological inventions, and publication of a lot many books. The whole process gets speeded up by the rise of what Toynbee describes as the proletariat. Proletariats are those elements of society which were excluded from the benefits of civilization to which they belong, and so much excluded to say that they turn against basic features of that very civilization. They may be slaves, they may be plebeians of Rome, disfranchised gentry of England, etc. All sorts of diverse people with only one uniformity, that having been excluded by the dominant minority from the benefits of civilization, that is, turn against its basic values. Proletariats exist in all times, but it is in the declining phase of civilization that their subvertive role becomes crucial. As the decline sets in, the universal state collapses, innovations decline, and religion becomes more and more ritualistic and superstitious. So, when religion starts becoming more superstitious, more ritualistic, then think where you are leading to, according to Toynbee, not me. These are the symptoms which show that a particular civilization has run its full cycle. Toynbee had difficulties in justifying his theory in the context of Indian and Chinese civilization. These are two, exceptions. He could have only done that by arguing that these civilizations have run their full course and are now being replaced by Western civilization. That could be one of the arguments, but that is not a valid argument. But then, what is the nature of Western civilization? Toynbee says that its Christianity was based on Syriac tradition, and the scientific thought and culture was based on Hellenistic tradition. But then he forgets completely that the reinforcement of Hellenic values during the Renaissance period also accompanied at the same time the rejection of Christian values, so that if Christianity is the core of civilization, then Western civilization can be said to precede or antedate the Renaissance in the form of historical anachronism. Toynbee is religious and therefore argues rather plaintively that whereas science limits man's intellectual, religion expands it. Toynbee was repeatedly asked by his critics at that what point of life cycle is the Western civilization of our times. Is it, as Spengler forewarned, heading for its decline? So, Toynbee replied, rejecting Spengler's theory of average lifespan, and asserted that the life of Western civilization would depend on its ability to cope with the challenge and response theory which he had given. It is its responses and the stimuli these responses generate that would actually determine its life. During Toynbee's own lifetime, Western values were becoming increasingly dominant. Historians were thus confronted with the question of whether we are heading for a universal world civilization or something else. The concept of universalization of civilizations was becoming so common in Toynbee's own lifetime that his study of civilization as almost distinct entities marked by their own specific features and then moving in cycles was fast seeming to appear as applicable, if only to a limited extent, to the prehistory of world civilization.